I think you're coming from some of the places that I've been. This is called Walk in Balance. It's for you.
They took me from my Indian nation, tied me with a rope. They put me on a reservation, denied me any hope.
Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. I wondered what motivated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to be so passionate about his civil rights work. During my research, I came upon a 1963 book written by Dr. King entitled Why We Can't Wait. Dr. King was profoundly affected by the plight of Indigenous people during the colonization of what is now the United States of America. Those experiences included conquering of traditional tribal lands and mass genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a Noble Crusade. Beginning in the 1500s, European settlers sailed to what is now the Americas and colonized their newly discovered homelands and continued to push westward. In 1602, indentured servants were brought from Europe and Africans enslaved to drive the developing American economy. The Noble Crusaders forced assimilation and segregation. The civil rights movement of the 1960s pushed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People into national prominence. The NAACP created a legal defense fund to enforce the laws of the land, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voter Rights Act of 1965. In 1970, a group of young Native American attorneys took a page out of the NAACP playbook and established the Native American Rights Fund. NARF, as the organization came to be known, also used the legal system to enforce long-forgotten treaties between tribes and the United States government. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund and NARF, while working within the system, their missions were similar but different. I spoke with NARF founder John Echohawk.
Federal Indian policy at that time was one of termination of tribes, ignoring the treaties, forcing assimilation of native people, relocating them from the reservations into the cities. That was the federal policy. The other thing that was happening was our people, being the poorest of the poor, had no money for lawyers. And of course, as we learned in law school, unless you've got a lawyer, it doesn't matter what the laws are. You don't have any representation, you can't take those things to court and enforce the law. And so we had those two issues. But at the same time there in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was going on. The blacks were making tremendous gains through the courts because, of course, they were asserting one of the basic principles from the basic laws of the United States, and that is equal treatment. All men are created equal. Again, they had not had legal representation either to bring these cases forward until the NAACP Legal Defense Fund started. Me and the other Native students and a lot of the tribal leaders started paying attention to that and realized that we needed to start a similar legal defense fund for Native Americans. So when I graduated, I got together with some of these lawyers and some of these tribal leaders and became one of the founders of this Native American Rights Fund to provide legal representation to our people across the country in the most important cases and assert our rights under the treaties and laws of this country. And it really changed everything.
It's also been suggested that Dr. King was influenced by the early advocacy work of Calvin McGee, chief of the Porch Band of Creek people in Alabama. In 1947, 7 years before the United States Supreme Court overturned separate but equal school segregation in the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education case, Chief McGee organized an informal committee of Porch Creeks to meet with the county school district officials. The county refused bus transportation to Porch Creek students attending the junior high school. A tribal member named Jack Doherty stood in the path of a school bus and refused to move until the driver allowed the Porch children to board. After filing a lawsuit, the tribe was successful in forcing school integration. Even so, children continued to be segregated. Light-skinned Porch Creek students were sent to white schools, while dark-skinned students had to attend black schools. It took 10 years to implement the Brown ruling before Minnie Jean Brown walked into an Arkansas classroom.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now. And their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
Such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court.
The Supreme Court decision also applied to tribal members being allowed to attend the mainstream public schools in Alabama. Like a century before, the Noble Crusade, designed to convert nomadic people into sedentary city dwellers, was a failure at best. The problems created by this policy are well documented, including by Boulder filmmaker Jerry Aronson. He produced an Oscar-nominated documentary entitled The Divided Trail.
Like a lot of other Indian tribes, the Chippewas have been uprooted. A lot of us have moved away from the reservations to the cities. And there, without our land and without our traditions, we're lost. We occupied abandoned land to get publicity, and abandoned housing because we needed it. And we'd stay at each place until they kicked us out. Our problems are very clear. You take the government's own statistics. They say that we have the highest infant mortality rate, and the highest suicide rate, and the highest unemployment rate. and the lowest annual income, and an almost total lack of education. We really wanted to show people what it was like for us.
It helped too that the federal policy changed at the same year that we started in 1970, where the federal government realized that this termination assimilation policy was wrong, and they needed to recognize the treaties and the sovereignty of tribes, and recognize their right to determine their own futures, the self-determination era. So that started the same year that we started at the Native American Rights Fund. Self-determination policy was set in 1970, and that's been the policy now for 51 years, which is great. You know, treaties, supreme law of the land, you know, sovereignty. You know, we are able to determine our own futures as sovereign governments, and that's recognized by the federal government, the state governments, and you know that those relationships have developed over the years.
Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. Colonization and racism were sources of entertainment. Native Americans were portrayed in the media as savages. Businesses in the West posted "No Indians or Dogs Allowed" notices on their storefronts.
Oh, I come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. As I grind to Louisiana, my true love for the sea.
In the Deep South, blacks and whites had separate bathrooms and recreation centers. Such laws and societal customs were associated with Jim Crow. Thomas Rice was a struggling entertainer who performed during the 1820s. He was a white actor who was the first to wear blackface. His act feigned an exaggerated black character. White audiences were receptive to his popular minstrel show.
Come listen, all you gals and boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song, my name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about I jump Jim Crow.
His act sold out in the South and eventually took him to New York City in 1832, where Jim Crow was solidified into the American culture. And a descriptor for socially acceptable discrimination toward other minority groups, including Native Americans. The Native American Rights Fund has worked to reverse cultural stereotypes that have oppressed tribes by advocating for civil rights and tribal sovereignty.
We knew the people at Alcatraz, visited out there. Knew the people at Wounded Knee visited there. And here most recently up at the Dakota Access Pipeline, assisted there directly in one of those things because the Standing Rock Sioux tribe asked for the support of the other tribes across the country. And that was led by the National Congress for American Indians, the national intertribal organization. And we represented them, we represent them on other things, so they asked us if we would file a friend of the court amicus curiae brief for the NCAI and other tribes in support of the Standing Rock Sioux there against that Dakota Access Pipeline. So we have done that on a number of occasions as the different issues on that case have come before the court. So we continue to be involved in that since, of course, it's still pending. That was one of our first cases, the treaty fishing rights case for the tribes in northwest Washington. Yes, because a lot of the news about Native Americans at that time was the demonstrations going on up in that part of the country. Again, Indians getting arrested for not having state fishing licenses, asserting their rights under the treaties to fish without the state licenses, and a lot of them getting arrested and taken to jail, and over and over and over again, and just a huge controversy going on. And of course, we researched that and read the treaties and everything, and the treaties of 1855 said these tribes were entitled to fish at their usual and accustomed places in common with the citizens of the state. Testimony of tribal leaders in terms of how they interpreted those provisions was relevant. And the court went with the tribes and the tribal position and ruled that tribes are entitled to take 50% of the fish. And as sovereign nations, they were co-managers of the fishery together with the state of Washington. And it just really kind of shocked everybody up that way. Of course, the state of Washington appealed the case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals affirmed that decision. Yes, they have these treaty rights to fish, and then the state of Washington took that on to the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's what these treaty rights are. And so a huge victory for tribes under the treaties, and of course it really kind of woke everybody else up too about the continuing validity of the treaties. The treaties are not ancient history. They're the law of the land, the supreme law of the land.
Our children are still taught to respect the violence which reduced a red-skinned people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups herded onto impoverished reservations.
One of the things that a good organizer or a good Indian leader always does recognize, and he better recognize, or he's not in that position very long, is that the movement and the direction that his people must go in has to come from those people. Like many Indians before us, we went to Washington trying to get programs established for Indian people.
The problems that they're looking at, are the problems of the whole nation. Because when this nation can't answer to the smallest of its minorities, then it can not answer to itself as a nation.
The NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Native American Rights Fund can't make social change happen all by themselves.
Dozens of American cities up in flames after some protests turned into riots.
Your water is under attack!
Stand up, fight back!
We're here to pray. We're just here to pray.
Their work empowers communities and provides a platform for the rest of us to undo the Noble Crusade. That's not an easy task. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. If others are discriminated against, the dominant culture benefits whether you want it to or not. Where can we start? We can rant and chant, wave and rave, but when the rally is over, then what? What if we created a new narrative rather than fighting the old one? Instead, speak up, be an ally. Engage with your friends and acquaintances, one-on-one or in small groups.
I would just point out that this conversation would be virtually impossible to have on social media before a bunch of trolls just went after you.
A lot of times when one shares their point of view, the other person hears it as, oh, so you're saying my point of view is wrong just because you have a different point of view. So now we just have to battle. And that's so sad.
Be accountable to one another.
not just trying to form a consensus or a resolution, that we're just trying to better understand ourselves, to grow in our understanding, and take the time to listen to the experiences of one another.
If I can have the opportunity to listen to others so that I can gain more of a universal understanding, then I can essentially, I guess, condition myself to be a more inclusive human being. So that's what drew me to a conversation like this.
Commit yourselves to being allies.
I try to imagine a world where everybody's just like me. It's just a waste of energy because it's not reality anyway. So why not just get to know people as they are? And as we engage in each other's stories, we become different people.
Challenge oppression as you see fit.
I'm used to being criticized by my black liberal friends and so forth for keeping company with conservatives, and then around conservatives, I'm used to being criticized for giving so much credence to left-wing social perspectives on various things, And so I say, I enjoy these sorts of conversations with people like yourselves, and I really think that there is sort of a swelling of this type of consciousness, I guess, in this country right now. I feel it.
As Martin Luther King said, every person of humane conviction must decide on the protest that best suits them. But we all must protest.